Hi everybody, today I'm going to talk about aeolian environments. Aeolian environments are wind-blown environments. They require dry sediment because wet sediment is cohesive. If you think about sand castles or wet sticky mud. So aeolian environments most commonly occur in dry environments like deserts, but that doesn't necessarily mean that all aeolian environments are desert environments. For example, on the right-hand side, we've got two images, one on the left, one on the right. And on the right-hand side is a beach, and sand dunes are very often associated with beach environments where wind blows sand, dry sand, from the beach on shore, and so you get coastal sand dunes are very common. On the left hand is a much larger depositional environment, aeolian depositional environment, the Sahara Desert in North Africa, which has vast tracts of land covered by wind-blown sands and sand dunes. The most characteristic feature of aeolian environments are large-scale sand dunes that leave behind large-scale cross-stratification, like the cross-stratification shown here. And you can see some trees down here for scale. This is the Navajo sandstone, and it is a single large-scale Aeolian deposit that blanketed much of the western U.S. during the Jurassic. Windblown dunes leave behind such large-scale cross-stratification because windblown dunes are large and the atmosphere is thick relative to thinner continental flows of water like those that occur in rivers. You just simply can't get cross-stratification this thick in rivers because the flow in rivers is not deep enough to do that. Aeolian sands accumulate in large arid basins like this one in western China. Scale bar up in the upper right-hand corner. Sand seas like this are called ergs. You can note the enlargement of this area that's shown in the lower right, and you can see that most of this large inland basin is covered with dune upon dune upon dune, which if you actually go there and look at it, looks something like this. In the center of that basin, all you can see are just dunes for miles and miles around. Windblown sand dunes come in several forms, depending on the prevailing wind direction or directions that are responsible for creating them. Barchan, upper left, and transverse, upper right, are two types of dunes that are created by a single wind direction. The difference between them is largely a function of sand supply. Barchan dunes, the ones on the left, are isolated accumulations of sand that tend to occur where sand supply is limited, whereas transverse dunes form where sand supply is much more abundant. Linear dunes occur where two orthogonal or high-angle wind directions operate simultaneously or seasonally, and these dunes have several sets of slip faces that create cross beds at a high angle to each other, as shown in this rose diagram right here. Star dunes occur where many wind directions operate at about the same time, and this creates many different slip faces and many different directions of cross-bedding. Take a moment to look at these images of desert sand dunes. Try to figure out which kind of dunes they are. I think what we'll do is we'll start with A, A is a set of linear dunes. And in this direction, in this particular image, I think the winds are blowing sort of towards us and in that direction, stringing the sand along into these long linear ribbons that are parallel to the bisecting angle between the two wind directions. On the right, B, these are Barcan dunes, and the wind direction is towards the viewer again. And spread out like that simply because of perspective. C is a satellite image of transverse dunes, and you can see that the wind direction was blowing perpendicular to the crest of those dunes, and the wind in this area was spreading out. It was a very small scale image, and those dunes are actually very large. And then finally, D is a star dune complex in Death Valley. You can see that the crests sort of meet in complicated ways. But even this star dune off to the north here, which is up, starts to transform into transverse dunes, because the wind direction here is pretty uniformly like that. A dra'a is a large-scale megadune built over thousands to hundreds of thousands of years by multiple forms of migrating dunes. Many of these dunes have smaller dunes superimposed upon them. The smaller dunes then migrate over the relatively stable dra'a. This image shows several dra'a, and I'll just label them for you. And each of these dra'a have these sand flats in between them. You might be able to pick out a whole bunch of other forms of dunes that are superimposed upon the larger dra'a. Some of these dra'a attain heights of hundreds of meters and widths of several kilometers. So there's no scale bar on this, but that's about a kilometer. So even the smaller scale features here are full-sized, full-fledged dunes. And you can see some linear dunes. And there's plenty of star dunes. These might be transverse. And there's some barcans in here as well. The slip faces of dunes are places where the sediment's being deposited, and these are thus places of active sediment accumulation. And two things occur to produce or to deposit sediment on the slip faces of dunes. One is just simply the flow of sand from above down onto the slip face below. So this little sand body that I'm highlighting here is a Grainflow that started up near the top of the slip face, and then all that sand traveled downslope as a fluid made of dry sand. Here's another one over here. And you can make these by simply standing at the top of a dune slope and kicking some sand down it. So that's one process, Grainflow, that sends sand down the slip face of the dune. You can see that these Grainflows, however, are deposited on top of an older set of ripples that were migrating along this dune slip face under a wind current that was blowing parallel to it, sort of like that. The deposits of Grainflow lenses, such as the one that I've labeled with number 1, are thin and can be, an inch or 2 in thickness. They're inversely graded so that there's coarser grains on the top, finer grains on the bottom, and they coarsen down towards the toe of the dune. The deposits of wind-blown ripples are different from the deposits of current ripples. Wind-blown ripples don't have any internal cross-stratification, and they tend to create a unique pinstripe lamination consisting of a layer of coarse grains above a layer of fine grains, and that lamination simply repeats. Each one of those layers is much thinner than the deposits of a single grain flow, be on the order of millimeters instead of inches. And so those are the two processes that deposit sediment on the downwind portion of a dune called the dune slipface. So why do ripples deposit this pinstripe lamination when they're blown by wind? Well, it's because wind ripples owe their origin to the bombardment of high velocity grains being blown by the wind and falling out of suspension. These smaller grains that are firing at the sandy bed pick up the coarser grains and move them by impact creep. Basically, the small grains impact the larger ones and nudge them forward downwind as bed load. Ripple spacing is determined by the mean saltation length of ripples. So spacing such as that shown on the illustration here on the photograph here is basically the average length that a sand grain travels in saltation before coming back down to the bed and impacting another grain. So sand gets picked up from the downstream parts of hollows in between ripples. So if you start with a bed that's slightly irregular like the one shown above here, and you imagine that there's a rain of grains impacting the bed at a low angle that are falling out of suspension. Basically, these are the downwind ends of saltation paths. These grains are hitting the bed at various points and nudging along the coarser grains. And those coarser grains will continue to be nudged by this impact until they reach the crest. And you've got a traffic jam up here because those grains are no longer going to be moved by impact from above if they're in this sheltered area. So what happens then is you get these grains coming down, hitting the bed, bouncing back up, hitting the bed again, bouncing back up and hitting the bed again. But this whole area here is sheltered from that because the angle of impact is lower than the angle of that slope. And this is where all the coarse grains that are being nudged along are going to tend to accumulate. And as these ripple forms move along the bed by the wind, you basically keep depositing this carpet of coarser grains above a bed of finer grains beneath them. And again, there's no cross bedding here. You don't have grains sliding down the downwind side of ripples to create cross beds like you do in underwater environments. Here it's all just movement by impact. And there's your pinstripe lamination. Here on this slide, you can see that all of the coarse grains are deposited along the crests of ripples. And that's just simply because this is the sheltered zone where all those coarse grains creeping along by impact are getting concentrated. So as these ripples migrate downwind, they'll leave a trail behind them of coarse grains parked on top of finer grains. So sand dunes form in equilibration with a constant wind of some sort or another, and if the wind direction or strength changes, either during different seasons or just overall over a long period of time, then dunes can become blown out like the surface of these dunes shown in the photo. If the wind becomes stable again and re-equilibrates in the same direction or a different direction, then these blowout dunes may reactivate and restabilize to form sharp slip faces like the one shown here. And this sharp slip face is active. Sand is blowing up the upwind portion of this slip face and then being deposited mostly by Grainflow on the downwind side. So this reactivation would create, if this dune continued to migrate from left to right, would create a surface right along here that symbolizes the reactivation of one dune on top of another, and this would be a form of reactivation surface that's very common in aeolian environments. In aeolian sand dune environments, it's very common to see winds change direction with the season, and sometimes under perfect conditions this can be preserved in the cross stratification produced by dunes. So here we see several layers of sand that are arranged in sort of a cyclic manner. So here we've got 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. You basically have a rhythm of a thick interval of sand that is cross-stratified like this, and then a thinner interval of sand that from a distance doesn't appear to have any cross-bedding at all, but is probably cross-stratified simply in a different direction. And these two types of layer are deposited one after the other in a rhythmic fashion, such that the thickness of one is close to the thickness of two. The thickness of one is always thicker than two, and two is always thinner than one. And then they're stacked repeatedly above one another. So these are just different intervals of time during which the wind was blowing was blowing different directions. And 1 and 2 basically represent probably seasonal changes in wind direction. As we saw earlier, smaller dunes can be superimposed upon larger dunes and draw like the smaller dunes in this draw are superimposed upon it. And this is very similar to what dunes do in other environments. Smaller dunes in a river can be superimposed upon larger sandbars. The migration of smaller dunes upon larger dunes creates complex patterns of crossbeds that are separated by what are called superposition surfaces on the upwind faces of dunes. In environments with a relatively sparse supply of sand, areas between the dunes may be filled with either sand flats or something other than sand. So here the interdune areas between sand dunes are filled with saline lake deposits that dry up to form thin layers of evaporites or dry up to form mud cracks. As the dunes migrate over these lake deposits, they leave behind beds of cross-bedded sand that overlie thin deposits of mud or evaporites. If the sand blows completely away, it may form a regional surface that preserves the moist sand below and won't be buried by anything else until another system, maybe more sand dunes, deposits more sediment above it. The architecture of Aeolian deposits is a mosaic of all these types of surfaces, each one cross-cutting lower-order counterparts. The lowest order surfaces are the crossbeds themselves, here called foresets, the dash lines. And these are cut by reactivation surfaces that occur occasionally and dip in the same direction as the crossbeds, but at a lower angle. One dune set superimposed upon another is recorded by superposition surfaces. Superposition surfaces are either horizontal or dip slightly upwind. Interdune surfaces cross-cut superposition surfaces and represent the larger gaps between dune complexes where you can have either lake sediments or sand flats. And then finally, everything may be cut by something called a supersurface. A supersurface is a surface created when an entire complex of sand dunes blows out entirely, leaving behind only that sand that was unable to be blown away, maybe because it was wet or maybe because it was already lithified. And then you can deposit something else on top of that supersurface, perhaps more sand dune deposits. So here's a set of cross-bedded Aeolian sands in the Navajo sandstone. And the trick here is to try and interpret different types of surfaces in this outcrop. Well, the crossbeds are pretty easy. You can see the crossbeds here. So that would be just the four sets, the lowest order surface. You can see some more sets of crossbeds here. The crossbeds in a few places are cross-cut by surfaces that dip in the same direction, but at a lower angle than the crossbeds themselves. These would be reactivation surfaces. The reactivation surfaces are cross-cut by superposition surfaces, such as this one, where you get one set of cross-bedded sand superposed on top of another. And we see there's another reactivation surface in here. And there are some intervals in here where it appears that we have some sand flat deposits in between each successive dune complex. So perhaps right here you have a thin interval that might be some sort of interdune deposit. But pretty clearly, at least the stuff down below, reactivation surface, cutting cross beds, all dipping in the same direction. Okay, that's it for Aeolian deposits. The next presentation that I'll record is lacustrine deposits. Thanks for listening.